Hello everybody, I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for literature and coping skills. I'm here again with a new lecture on verbal imagery and healing. If you remember, in my last lecture I talked about some of the critical aspects of verbal imagery and healing. I also tried to show how verbal imagery ultimately leads to our healing and how verbal imagery is such a powerful process that people are using it as a therapeutic technique for healing mental challenges. In my last lecture, I focused on a few very important components such as imagery, longing for form, the power of imagery, verbal imagery, imagery and healing, and finally on neuro-linguistic programming. So as we moved from the first towards the last component in my last lecture, we gradually discovered how imagery plays an important role in our understanding of the thinking and experiencing processes and also in our understanding of the healing process. So today I am going to talk about some other important aspects of verbal imagery and healing. Let's take a look at those. I am going to talk about verbal imagery as therapy while focusing on some of its therapeutic aspects. I am also going to talk about image therapy through three very important examples in the form of extracts taken from poems written by great poets across ages. So these are the two very important things that we're going to do today, and at the end of today's lecture I'm sure you'll be able to understand the power of verbal imagery and how it can lead to healing. So let's take a look at each of these components. We all know verbal imagery has therapeutic effects, and we discovered some of its therapeutic effects in our last class. So meaning making process is very, very important. If you remember, I talked about the sense making process that humans engage themselves with, which in fact leads to the production of meaning. The meaning making process is all about connecting the dots. While talking about the longing for form, I told you all that it's an inherent, it's a natural desire in humans to see things in order, to attach or assign a form to the otherwise formless things. Same is the case with our understanding and feeling. When we feel a distressing emotion, a disturbing emotion, which challenges our very form, our very existence, we promptly want to overcome that by overcoming that particular problem. So that particular problem can be overcome when we begin to engage in a meaning making process. And this meaning making process depends a lot on verbal imagery. I'll explain how. If I show you a picture, an image, that will definitely have an impact on you. So that image will certainly communicate a lot of things to you and you will derive that message easily. So if I show you a ready-made image, that will have an important effect on you, but it will be inadequate in terms of your engagement. Your engagement will be partial because you are not creating that image. You are trying to understand or make sense of that image. You're trying to figure out the message that is contained in that image. But if I ask you to write down a few words, that will present your current mental state, not your regular or general mental state. For example, you're feeling very, very angry. And if I ask you to express that particular mental state using a few words, then you begin to make a picture with words. So when you begin to make a picture with words, that means you're engaging in that process, and that meaning making process will be stronger. And that's the reason why I use the example, the task of talking about life, what life is according to you. Because you promptly find a word that will present your idea of life. So therefore, the moment you do that, you're actually engaging in a meaning making process. So verbal imagery, because you are going to create an image through words, and the image that you create will give you more relief than the image that you see. So that's the difference between seeing and making a picture, because while making a picture we have to connect a few dots so that we can make meaning in a much better way. The second thing, which is equally important, is empathic listening and decision making. So it may happen that sometimes we create or use words to talk about ourselves. We want somebody else to empathically listen to us so that a decision can be made. It may also happen that when we engage with literary forms, including poetry or fiction and drama, we come across words. They are not just words, they are speech elements. Somebody is trying to say something to us. It's an intersubjective condition, situation. It's an interpersonal situation, because that's how we begin to engage with literary works, through the interpersonal mode. It's an interpersonal. That means there's a person outside the literary work, that's you, and there's a person at least inside the work, that's a character. And then you begin to interact with that character through an interpersonal approach or an intersubjective approach. That can happen only when there is empathic listening. It may happen even in the absence of empathic listening, but it will be a mechanical activity. So the connection will not be established. Mirror neurons will not be activated if it's not an empathic approach. So we need to listen to the sounds, the words that are expressed. So once we begin to listen to the sounds and the words that are expressed, once we begin to see the picture, see the image that are created with the help of these words, that will lead to greater decision making. For example, you come across a piece of poetry in which you find a character who is struggling with a certain mental challenge, say anxiety or depression. Then you would like to see how that character manages, or whether that character manages or not. The first thing that you would like to know. If you get to know that the character actually manages to overcome that problem, which will mean that it will give a complete form to that particular action. It will have a start, it will have a middle, it will have an end, and it will be complete. So you'll definitely be curious, interested in knowing how that character overcomes that problem. So when it's empathic listening, you gradually move along with that character in the decision making process, because the character will definitely make a decision at the end. So also you may have a different approach to the whole problem, so you may go for a different decision, but the decision making process will happen at the end, and it will happen only when there is empathic listening, and through listening you get to see that picture. So in this case, listening is seeing. So it's important that we learn how to listen to this process, how to listen to the words and how to see that image. And then it will lead to the modification of action tendencies. Action tendencies are those emotional responses or responses to those emotions that we naturally adopt. For example, if I'm angry with somebody, I'd like to either curse the person or attack the person. If I'm experiencing the emotion of fear, then I would like to flee that situation, flee that moment, so that I can protect myself. These are some action tendencies that are natural to the humans. But then there is a need to modify these action tendencies. Fleeing the object of your fear or the condition of your fear will not help you overcome that. You can flee and protect yourself, but that fear might return to you and disturb you again. So when that happens, you will flee again. So fleeing will be a regularity with you, which is not going to solve the problem ever. So there is a need to modify these action tendencies. These initial action responses may be very, very natural, but then we can consciously modify those action tendencies so that we learn how to take care of those disturbing or challenging emotions or emotional experiences. So when it comes to modifying action tendencies, we focus a great deal on goal-directed behavior. If my goal is to overcome that problem, then I must modify that particular action tendency. For example, if my goal is to overcome that fear of mine, I may have an exam phobia, and that's the reason why I run away from exams. The very moment the exam schedule is announced, I begin to experience anxiety and fear in me. So that's an action tendency. That's an action response to fear, the fear of exam, if I am at all afraid of exams. So instead of adopting this action tendency, I can think of modifying that particular tendency so that I know how to overcome that fear. So I need to fix my goal. If my goal is to pass, do well, then I have to modify my behavior or action tendencies. How do I do that? I have to fix a goal. Yes, I want to succeed in this examination. Then I have to fix. These are the things I must do in order to overcome that particular phobia or fear. And when I do that, I will see that I have been successful in overcoming that fear. So modifying action tendencies can happen when we adopt a goal-directed behavior. And that's exactly where you need the power of verbal imagery, because you need to talk about it, rehearse it, say it time and again. through words. Finally, I don't have words to express. This is a kind of tendency or approach versus naming through verbal leads. We have talked about the inability to express and the power of naming, which can lead to the taming. So most often we find it inadequate to express our feelings, emotions and experiences through words. So most often we withdraw. We say, I don't have words to express my feelings for you. I'm shocked, I don't have words to express my shock. I'm surprised, I don't have words to express my surprise. I'm so excited, I'm overwhelmed, I don't have words. And that actually happens. The executive side of the brain goes blank at times when we pass through strong emotional phases. That happens. Therefore, it becomes extremely difficult for us to find words to express. And that leads to some kind of limitations in our expressive approach. So, how can we overcome that? We can in fact find verbal leads, and we can name those feelings properly. Verbal leads. For example, if I give you a lead, how am I feeling? I am feeling, and then I may say one word, then you add another word to it, then I say another word, then you add one more word to that. So with the help of verbal leads, you can always complete. You might have come across such things. For example, you come across a few words of a statement, then you are asked to complete that statement. So most often you find that easier in comparison to the question that write an independent statement. Many often you are asked to complete a story with cues, with certain leads. So we find it easier to do that, because those are the verbal leads that help us express ourselves properly and completely, adequately. So verbal imagery or words allow us to express our feelings, emotions and experiences. So that brings us to this very interesting and very popular extract that I have taken from Wordsworth's Daffodils. You might have come across this extract, or you might have read this poem as well. It's one of the most popularly used poems in poetry therapy. Daffodils, and this is the first stanza. Take a look at this extract. We'll find a few very interesting things here. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So, the moment you read these lines, you'll be able to create an image. If you're able to see the image of something, then you are on the right track. You have that ability. So you can see that image. There are various images. The image of a person who is wandering aimlessly. So there is an analogy between a wandering person and the wandering clouds. And there is a similarity between these two, and both of them are lonely. And then something happens, and that something happens suddenly, all at once. That something happens suddenly. So when that something happens suddenly, you can see a shift, and that shift is very, very distinct. So that distinct shift allows you to focus on the other part of this extract, the next 4 lines, where you suddenly experience that things have changed. There is no talk of loneliness, there is no talk of wandering. When do you wander? You wander only when you are disturbed, you are anxious, you are not at ease with yourself, you wander. So, there is no wandering, there is no expression of loneliness, there is an expression of golden daffodils beside the lake, the trees fluttering, dancing. So, suddenly there is a change in the perspective. This is very popularly called perspective shift. I will come to the idea of perspective shift in detail, but let me talk about perception as such. We experience things either through perception or through, automatic creation. We may create experiences in the absence of stimulus. We don't need any external stimulus to create experiences and feelings in us. For example, there is no announcement of the examination. I may still think about examination and experience fear. So, I may perceive the fear of examination in the absence of that stimulus. Perception is a reality because the things that we perceive turns out to be our truth, and they also limit our perspectives. We cannot adopt a wider perspective then. We adopt a very narrow and limited perspective because that turns out to be a reality for us, the truth for us, and we continue to believe that that is a reality. And we find it very, very difficult to change the perspective or shift the perspective. So, shifting of the perspective happens when our imagery shifts, the images that we built about our experiences, our mental states. When those images shift, the perspective also shifts. For example, I will show you 1, 2, 3 sad images. You will gradually begin to feel sad. Then suddenly I will show you a happy image. You can understand that your mood has suddenly changed. That is the power of perspective shift. So, what we see here, if we go back to the extract, we will see that in the first 2 lines, the perception of reality is that it is very harsh, it is disturbing, it is distressing emotionally. Therefore, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over the hills and the vales. And then suddenly there is a perspective shift. When that happens, the same person who was wandering and lonely, suddenly feels better and relaxed. So, that is the power of perspective shift, and that happens when we treat verbal images, or we take a cue from verbal leads and switch to a different perspective, a better perspective. So, we can expand our perception of situations, events and behaviors by changing our perspective. That is exactly what happens in this example. So, let us take a quick look at each of these 3 examples that are lined up. The first example, it's an extract from John Keats. When I have fears that I may cease to be. I must tell you that all these extracts that I have selected for discussion focus on fear, the idea of fear, and how each of them approaches the idea of fear through a different set of images, verbal images. Let's take a quick look at that. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. So you can see the fear of, dying untimely, well before you have completed your tasks properly, you have become famous, you have contributed substantially, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books, before I have contributed substantially in character, greatness, hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. So suddenly there is a comparison, there is an analogy between one's achievement with that of ripened grain. So we can see that even the grain has, before the grain has ripened. So if we do not get access to it, if we lose it, what will happen? So Keats is talking about his fear of death in this manner. What's important about this particular thing is, this particular extract is, this particular standpoint adopted by Keats is that he has adopted a goal imagery. I have already talked about goal imagery, if you remember. In my last lecture, I talked about coping imagery and goal imagery. A goal imagery gives you a goal. So what is a goal for John Keats here? The goal is that of making a substantial contribution. So although he is moved by the fear of death, he is still focusing on those things that he would like to do. So if he sticks to that particular thing, then there is every possibility that his behavior will be goal directed and his action tendency will be modified. And that's exactly what happens. This is the second example. I am afraid, oh I am so afraid. The cold black fear is clutching me tonight, as long ago when they would take the light and leave the little child who would have prayed, frozen and sleepless at the thought of death. That's taken from Sarah Teasdale, Fear. So when you look at this, I'm afraid, oh I am so afraid, I can take you back to I think I can, I see I can. So if you practice positive thinking or positive visualization, there is every possibility that you will get into that mode. But if you do not do that, you will definitely get into the negative mode, the death wish or the death instinct mode, the survival mode as well, and not be able to overcome it. So when somebody repeats that, I'm afraid, I'm so afraid, and then frozen and sleepless at the thought of death, you're so afraid, that means you're not ready to change the perspective. It's a limited perspective that you're afraid. It's a narrow perspective that you're frozen and you're unable to change that perspective. When you do so, there will be no change in it, because there is just one kind of image, one kind of imagery that you have created for yourself. That's the image of death, which is frightening, scary, which makes you frozen and sleepless. So that's another example. The last example has been taken from Elizabeth Jennings, Night Sister. It's again an extract. We have grown cynical and often miss the perfect thing. Embarrassment also convinces us we cannot dare to show our sickness. But you listen and we know that you can meet us in our own distress. So, there is an attempt at perspective shift. We have grown cynical and often miss the perfect thing. There's no doubt about it. He accepts it. Okay? If you remember, Dana Falls, he's allowing this feeling. He is accepting that as a fact. But at the same time, he also says that yes, embarrassment also convinces us that we cannot dare to show our sickness. We cannot show our sickness, but we have so much to say, so much to share, so much to show. But there is something else that stops or prevents us from doing that. In this case, embarrassment. But you listen and we know that you can meet us in our own distress. So you can meet us in our own distress. So if we are not distressed, then there is every possibility that we can easily overcome. If we are not embarrassed at showing our sickness, sharing our sickness, then we can easily overcome. So that's the idea. So there is an attempt, there is a conscious attempt at changing the story, changing the narrative, hence changing the life position. So that's how we come to the end of this lecture. I hope you have liked the things that we discussed today. I'll meet you again in my next lecture. Thank you for joining.